secrets of the past are all around us, hidden in our streets, buried under our feet. And in this series, I'll be uncovering those secrets as I explore Britain's most historic towns. I'll be deciphering physical clues. It's like very early animation. And getting to know some extraordinary characters who are often overlooked.
His nickname was the on-crowned King of Scotland.
Really? With the help of Ben Robinson's Eye in the Sky, I'll discover which towns across the UK reveal the most about each period in British history and find out how those stories still resonate today.
You could call it the world's first overdraft authorisation.
It's quite overwhelming.
From the adventurous Elizabethans to the elegant Georgians, from medieval knights through to the height of empire,
I'll tell the story of an era through the story of a single town. Today, I'm going to discover how a town's success during Britain's great industrial age created a workshop of radical ideas that changed the world.
That cements the closest, most important political friendship in world history.
Where principled working people endured great pain to ensure the liberty of the enslaved.
Lincoln writes from the White House saying how he was truly stunned that people who were taking the bread out of their children's mouths, that nonetheless they supported what he had to say.
Where brilliant writers and relentless campaigners embodied a never-say-die spirit that lives on.
We see injustice and we're prepared to do something about it because we won't tolerate it.
If you really want to get a taste of the revolution that happened during Britain's industrial heyday, Manchester is the place to come. Modern Manchester, with a population of over 500,000, has almost become a byword for successful regeneration. World-class sport, science and education, a national media hub, an enviable public transport system, and rampant redevelopment are leading the way. The 20th century, when Britain's industrial base ebbed away, wasn't kind to Manchester. But now it's back, right where it belongs, a northern powerhouse pumping the rich blood of economic vitality and revolutionary identity around Britain, a role it's been performing for centuries. Originally a Roman fort, Manchester's position on the crossroads of medieval trade routes and its proximity to the Atlantic established it as a key merchant town. But its golden age arrived as it became the fulcrum of Britain's first industrial revolution from the 1780s onwards. The harnessing of steam power drove highly mechanised production on a vast scale. It brought great riches for a privileged few, but for the factory workers, it was low wages, cramped housing, and continued disenfranchisement. But out of those dark, satanic mills would emerge radical new ideas and a spirit of activism that would ripple out across Britain through the 19th into the 20th century and beyond. And so many of those revolutionary ripples started right here in Manchester. Back in 1844, a gifted novelist called Benjamin Disraeli had one of his characters express a telling thought when a friend proposed a visit to Athens. "The age of ruins is past," he said. "Have you seen Manchester? Manchester is as great a human exploit as Athens." By the time that Disraeli was Prime Minister, some 30 years later, Manchester was an even more impressive metropolis, heaving with factories, with great civic buildings and with game-changing thinkers. It was a city ripe with possibilities. And all of this because of a century of breakneck change, which made Manchester world famous. And yet, going back to 1775, there wasn't a single mill in the city. So how did Manchester change so fast? To find out, I've come to what became known as Cottonopolis to meet local historian Jonathan Schofield.
Great to see you. Hello.
Now, Manchester's almost synonymous with the Industrial Revolution, so how did it play out here? What happened in this city?
Well, you have to go before the Industrial Revolution to a whole system which was called the domestic system. And that's individual families producing cotton cloth.
So this was people spinning and weaving at home?
Yeah, we've got the example here. You've got one of those many buildings which you can still see scattered across the city centre. A three-storey building with, on the top storey, you've got this row of windows.
Those windows up there?
The windows there. One long row of windows, which is a workshop, which allows the light to come in so you can do all the fiddly work to do with textiles. So what you get is hand-powered production in vast quantities of cotton cloth. And cotton becomes the, well, to use a modern phrase, cool fabric of the time. So it becomes a fashion, it's adopted by everybody, everyone wants to buy cotton. Manchester becomes the epicentre of cotton production.
The lives of Manchester's handloom weavers and domestic producers across the country were about to be revolutionised. An entrepreneur called Richard Arkwright had shown what could be achieved in a new type of workshop called a factory.
Richard Arkwright has a beautiful mill in the Peak District called Cromford Mill, and that's water-powered. And he thinks, well, where's the big exchange for cotton? It's in Manchester. So I've got these steam engines now. So in the 1780s, he opens the world's first steam-powered factory.
The success of Arkwright's methods encouraged investors to pour money into Manchester, with huge new textile factories sprouting up like mushrooms. What all the factors that came together, how did the planets kind of come into alignment to create the perfect situation for Manchester?
I think it's literally all those factors of an established textile business, a raw material coming in, an established workforce that sort of knew what it was doing, entrepreneurial spirit, the raw materials of production, i.e. coal beneath you, and absolutely that steam power moment.
Those new steam engines needed a constant supply of coal delivered to the door. Ben Robinson has sent his drone up to take a look at the transport network that would do the job, setting the mould for Manchester and industrial Britain.
The drone's perfectly positioned now. I'm looking at the Bridgewater Canal, and it gouges a great waterway through the landscape where none existed before. Now, the whole idea of this was to get coal from the Duke of Bridgewater's mines up in the Worsley area to the northwest of Manchester, right into where it was needed, to the steam-powered industry of the centre of Manchester. And once it tied in with the Rochdale Canal, you're suddenly linked into the whole of the north of England. Now, what I'm looking for here is the next phase of the work. And I'm just looking at the junction here. Yeah, a new branch heading right round to the south, and I can see it curving away here. It links up to the River Mersey, it links up to the sea. This makes Manchester one of the most connected places on the planet. It's all down to water transport. Oh, we've actually got a canal boat on it as well. Fantastic. It would have been a whole lot busier back in the Duke of Bridgewater's time.
The Industrial Revolution was underway, and as the 19th century began, it was that famous defeat of the French and Spanish at sea in 1805 that really boosted Manchester's rise. The Battle of Trafalgar had cemented the dominance of the Royal Navy, and the greatest threat to Britain's expansion and trade overseas had been removed. There was a huge global demand for cotton cloth, and there was plenty of work in the mills. This stimulated massive economic migration. From around 1790, thousands who'd struggled from harvest to harvest in rural communities flocked here for a steady wage, crowding into shoddy rows of basic houses. These terraces are what replaced them around 1870, But to find out what life here was like before that, I'm meeting Dr. Michaela Hume, an expert on the history of this Ancoats area.
Michaela,
Hello.
this looks like a lovely place to live now, but I presume it's completely different to what it would have been back in the day.
Yeah, so now this area is very hip, it's very trendy. It's the sort of place where you want to live in Manchester. But if you went back to 1850, this is hell on earth. This is the last place you'd want to live in the centre of Manchester.
And what was the density of occupation in houses like this?
Absolutely packed. So you would have had maybe 2 families in the basement, in a room maybe 10 by 10 foot square, no beds, so everybody would have slept on the floor or on just straw. And if there was a bed, you know, you would have got maybe 6 people in that bed. No provisions for human waste, so that is literally in the streets. There's also animal waste, because a lot of people did keep animals. They kept pigs. So there's dungs on the corner of the road. So not only was your house contaminated with the stench of everybody, disease was rife, you also couldn't get away from it when you stepped outside.
Yeah.
Because you couldn't see to the end of the road from the smoke of the factories.
And what were the wages like?
Not great. If you wanted to earn a decent wage, you needed to be a spinner or even an overseer. But if you were, say, a throstle spinner, which was sort of the lower end of spinner, you're earning about between 7 and 8 shillings. Now, if you're trying to rent a terraced house, you're looking upwards of 6 shillings.
It's all your money.
So for most people, just rent, you know, would have taken up the bulk of the wage.
And it must have been dangerous work as well in the mills. I mean, if you suffered an injury, presumably, you know, that was it.
Absolutely. As soon as you were injured, the guy who ran the factory didn't want to know. You were out, you know, out.
There's no welfare.
No, let's get somebody else able-bodied in.
Yeah. I think when you stand back and look at it, you look at the Industrial Revolution and you're a couple of centuries later, it looks like progress, but to the people going through it, it must have felt like anything but.
Yeah, especially for working class people. Some would have benefited probably more than others, but for your labouring class and your lower working class, those that were handling weavers before, they particularly struggled.
Hardship for the British working poor was about to get much worse. As the efficiency of machinery increased, less human labour was needed. Workers were laid off, and the gap between the haves and the have-nots widened.
To add to the darkening, febrile mood in Britain, revolution was sweeping through Europe like a contagion, guillotines slicing down on aristocratic necks, cutting down centuries of oppression, emboldening previously unheard radical voices. And here in Britain, it was in Manchester that those voices were heard the loudest.
I'm in Manchester to find out how the most successful industrial revolution town became a radical, potent force for political and social change in 19th century Britain. I've had a taste of how tough life was for the working poor here. Slum housing, brutally long hours, and declining wages.
So with all that suffering, surely something had to be done. I mean, Britain is a democracy. There would be MPs in Parliament representing these people's interests. Well, not so much in the 1800s.
Incredibly, after the general election of 1818, sparsely populated Cornwall sent 40 MPs to Parliament, while densely packed Manchester sent precisely none. To find out how this city led the drive to overhaul Britain's political map, I've come to meet historian Dr. Jeanette Martin.
Jeanette, hello.
Hello.
What was essentially wrong with British democracy in the early 1800s?
Well, the problem was it just wasn't very democratic because places like Manchester, Bradford, Leeds, Newcastle, Birmingham, they were driving the prosperity of the country at that point in time, and yet they had no voice at Westminster.
Yeah. So how did they start fighting for that?
Most important of all, they used print, so they used things like newspapers. And a really important newspaper was the Manchester Observer. So London had radical papers, but the Manchester Observer was unique in that its focus was on the industrialising north.
So what kinds of things were being covered in the newspaper?
The Observer was incredibly provocative and scurrilous, so it used to poke fun at the government. It was very direct in the kind of demands it wanted.
And as well as arguing for political reform, were they going as far as to organise protests?
One of the sort of ways in which they built a mass movement for parliamentary reform was to hold meetings and invite gifted, charismatic speakers to explain, you know, what would it mean if you had universal suffrage?
So there's one particular meeting then that goes down in history.
Yes, so the meeting happens on the 16th of August, 1819. Henry Hunt had been invited to speak in Manchester by the editor of the Manchester Observer, James Rowe. And the ordinary people were really, really interested in this celebrity speaker who, despite being a gentlemanly leader, was really interested in helping ordinary people get the vote.
That meeting took place at a field called St. Peter's, the scene of the infamous crushing of a peaceful protest that came to be called Peterloo.
That wall over there is the last remaining structure of the area that was St. Peter's Field. So Henry Hunt and the other speakers were on the hustings. They were on a raised platform. They were there to address roughly 50 to 60,000 people were estimated to have come to Manchester that day.
It's a huge number.
It's a vast number, and that's why the authorities were so scared. It was the largest meeting that had ever really been held.
Yeah. See what happened that day?
So just as Henry Hunt was starting to speak, the magistrates who were in a room overlooking the field sent word to the Manchester Yeomanry to go in and arrest the speakers. The Manchester Yeomanry were on horseback. They had sabres. They cut their way through to the hustings and they arrested the speakers. But can you imagine mounted soldiers going into a packed field, the panic that ensued? So at the end of that afternoon, 15 people were dead. 3 more would later die of their injuries, and up to 700 people were injured.
And was this written about in the newspapers?
It certainly was. So the Manchester Observer was the first to come up with the phrase Peterloo, and it was coined by James Rowe, the editor. And it was a very deliberate satirical pun on the Battle of Waterloo, a heroic event that had happened only 4 years earlier. And ironically, one of the people killed on the fields of St. Peter's Field was someone who'd fought at Waterloo.
Yeah,
so
very much framing it as a battle.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
While the authorities tried to cover up the unprovoked brutality with fake news, sympathetic Britons sought to help those suffering in the aftermath. This is Manchester's John Rylands Library, where I've been given special access to an extraordinary record of the money granted by the Peterloo Relief Fund, a nationwide subscription set up to support the families of the injured and killed.
So here's John Rhodes. We've got a very detailed record of the injuries that he sustained. John Rhodes, sabre cut on the head, by which he lost much blood. A woman saw him wandering about, bloody, and took him into her house, shaved off the hair and put on a plaster. He was dreadfully bruised internally, so that he's not since held up his head. And he died about the 18th of November. And the reason he's recorded here in this book, which is about providing poor relief, is that his father received some funds. This is really important because at the time, there's this alternative version of events emerging where this is a violent riot that's being put down. And we know that that wasn't the case. We know that this is a peaceful protest and that this is the brutal repression of that peaceful protest.
13 years after the terror of Peterloo, the Great Reform Act of 1832 was passed by Parliament. 67 new constituencies with MPs were created, including Manchester. But the hand that giveth also taketh away.
More men now had the vote, but only the wealthy ones. The factory workers certainly weren't going to the polls. And although women had never had the vote, Now they're specifically excluded in law, and it would take another 90 years to overturn that piece of legislation.
Meanwhile, a lack of democratic representation wasn't the only concern for Britain's impoverished workers.
This is Manchester's Free Trade Hall. In 1976, the Sex Pistols played a legendary gig here, which launched the punk rock scene in the UK. But this building was originally designed to honour the legacy of a man with even more anti-establishment leanings. His name was Richard Cobden, and he didn't want anarchy in the UK. He wanted reform.
Already a successful manufacturer of printed textiles in Manchester, in the late 1830s, Cobden focused his energy on the hated Corn Laws. For years, these laws had levied tariffs on imported cereals so the great landowners could charge the earth for their domestic products, helping keep them rich and the working poor half-starved and destitute. To learn more about the Anti-Corn Law League that Cobden spearheaded, I'm meeting historian Dr. Simon Morgan.
Hi, Alice.
Hi. So that's Cobden.
It is the man himself.
Why did he become so politically engaged?
Well, he's very much concerned that the economic ills of the 1830s and 40s, there's a huge sort of downturn that begins in the late 1830s, that the Corn Laws are making these worse, not just by increasing food prices, but also by depriving people of employment, because he believes that other countries are retaliating against Britain's tariffs on grain by introducing tariffs on British goods. So if you get rid of the Corn Laws, it's a virtuous circle. Not only does bread become cheaper, you've also got more trade with the likes of the United States and Russia and elsewhere buying goods from Lancashire. So people can afford to employ more hands in the factories.
And of course, eventually we do have the repeal of the Corn Laws. Peel repeals the Corn Laws. Does he do that because of Cobden? Is Cobden really instrumental in this?
There has been some controversy over this because Peel himself was moving to a free trade position even before 1846.
But Cobden had planted the seeds.
Yes, I think that's true. He keeps it really high on the political agenda.
What does Cobden do then? Hang up his boots?
Well, it doesn't bear fruit immediately, but in 1860 he goes over to Paris and he negotiates a commercial treaty with the French, which becomes the basis of a network of treaties across Europe over the next 10 years, and that has been seen as a forerunner of the European common market. Cobden is an idealist. He believes that the more countries trade with one another, the less likely they are to want to go to war with one another, and that you can actually promote universal peace and harmony by freeing up trade.
I like him. He does sound like a bit of a hero.
Men like Cobden sympathised with the working poor, but away from the industrial heartlands, the increasingly influential middle classes of the South had no idea how harsh factory life still was. But in an age of improving transport and literacy, a quieter type of radical would bear witness and spread the word. And so it would be great writing that would keep the Manchester Revolution rolling. I've come to Manchester, the original northern powerhouse, to trace its role as the driving force behind industrial and political change in 19th century Britain. Protests against stark inequalities had led to a somewhat fairer democracy, but it was the democratisation of travel that really got things moving. By the 1840s, there were train tracks across Britain, but one of the earliest and most important was built right here in Manchester.
Ben is taking a look at the extraordinary feats of engineering required to get the world's first public intercity railway up and running.
I'm looking at the railway from Liverpool up there to Manchester. It was the first to use just steam locomotives, no horse-drawn carriages like there were on earlier railways, and the first to use double track all the way through. But as George Stephenson came towards Manchester, he hit a problem. And the problem was this, the Sankey Valley running through the middle. And there was also a canal, the Sankey Canal. what to do. This, the Sankey Viaduct, never been done before on this scale. It's an amazingly impressive structure. I can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 9 arches here, and it's called the 9 Arches locally. Because the canal was still in use, the masts of the barges had to be able to pass underneath. So the canal company actually insisted that the arches were a minimum of 60 feet high or so. Now, there may have been bigger railway viaducts built in the world after this, but this was the one that proved the concept. This was the one that said, we can do it.
Transport links were opening up right across Europe, and in 1842, a 22-year-old German arrived in Salford to get some work experience at his father's cotton factory. His name was Friedrich Engels.
I'm meeting up with Jonathan Schofield again, outside the oldest public library in the English-speaking world, to find out why this young man's observations of Manchester had such an impact.
This is amazing. This is the famous Chetham's Library.
It is very famous. It's the oldest complete structure in Manchester, filled with the atmosphere of a myriad of very important people who came here. The dust motes are just filled with Dickens and Disraeli and Benjamin Franklin and, of course, Marx and Engels.
So how does Engels end up here? Because, I mean, he comes from modern-day Germany.
He does. He's a German. He ends up here because basically his dad wants to get him out of Germany. He's been called the scabby sheep of the family by his father.
Really?
And his father doesn't like all his progressive, radical ideas he's taken on board in Germany, so he says, hie thee hence to Manchester, where I part own a factory.
So his father sends him here to help manage his mill, but actually Engels ends up being much more interested in the condition of the people working there.
Well, Manchester is as big as Berlin. There's no German city as big as Manchester, aside from Berlin. And it's, whew,
absolutely heaving with people, and heaving with people who had a fairly miserable life.
Well, yes and no. I mean, of course, there was the middle class doing very well on the periphery, but you immediately sees that in the breezy heights of Cheetham Hill, you've got the big mansions, and then in the middle, you've got this fetid mess of humanity.
So presumably he's seeing the workers in the mill, but does he actually go to where they live as well?
Well, this is the remarkable thing about Engels. He's a young man in a hurry, and he wants to really get to see the nitty-gritty of the life of the workers. Now, we don't really know where he meets this young woman, but he meets a young woman called Mary Burns, who's from an Irish background, living in a hellhole of a place called the 13th District, and he would not be able to walk amongst the very poor quarters of the city of Manchester unless she was with him, because otherwise he loved his clothes, Engels, he was a smart-looking gentleman, he would have been robbed immediately. So she really showed him the people.
So she's really important to this story.
Oh, key to it. She is his passport.
Mary Burns had kept Engels out of trouble in Manchester, but it was his meeting in Paris with a fellow radical that would change the course of political history. That radical's name was Karl Marx.
And where does Marx come from?
Well, he's German as well. Karl Marx is German, of course. And so they meet in Paris, and they just sit down and talk for hours and hours and hours, and then that cements the closest, most important political friendship in world history.
So they've met up, they're aware of each other's work, they've had this meeting of minds in Paris, and then they end up here in Manchester.
Well, Engels comes back to Britain, and he brings Marx with him and says, see for yourself, come along. Marx is very willing to do that, so they come here to Chetham's, where they sit at this desk and chat and get books out. Not the most interesting books, one has to say, but if you're trying to base your theories on political economy, they're fantastically interesting for them. It's about fishery revenues and public revenues coming through the kingdom, and to do with the cotton trade and the cotton industry as well, which is the prime example of this industrial growth.
Inside the library, I'm heading for the desk where Marx and Engels actually sat and collaborated. 3 years of research and study eventually led to the publication in 1848 of a slim but extremely heavyweight pamphlet.
It was this. This is a copy of the original Manifest der Kommunistischen Party. It's the Communist Manifesto. There it is in German. My German's really poor, so I'm going to cheat and read it in the English translation. I'm not going to read all of it to you. I'm going to give you a very neat précis. Here's the beginning. A spectre is haunting Europe, the spectre of communism. And then if I skip to the very end, which doesn't take long, it's only about 50 pages in total. Let the ruling classes tremble at a communistic revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries, unite. Isn't it amazing that such a small book had such a huge impact in the 20th century?
This vivid call to arms would become arguably the single most influential political publication of all time. Its theories underpinning the Russian Revolution of 1917 and the creation of the Soviet Union. At the time, however, its impact was limited.
Now, amongst the wealthy, well-educated middle classes, there may have been an abstract recognition of a need for social change. But at the same time, it was difficult to imagine just how dire life could be for working-class men and women. And then it's impossible to empathise with them.
It would be a Manchester housewife with a talent for writing great stories that would help change this.
I've come to the house of Elizabeth Gaskell, and it's in Victoria Park, which was a very smart suburb just to the south of Manchester's 19th century industrial centre.
Dr. Faria Sheikh is going to help me understand why it was the writing of Gaskell and not Friedrich Engels that opened the eyes of the middle classes to the plight of Britain's working poor.
Faria, hi.
Hi.
This is Elizabeth Gaskell's house. It's lovely.
It is.
And this is a museum now.
It is a museum now.
Why is Elizabeth Gaskell so important?
Because of the way in which she portrays working life in Manchester. Her novels, Mary Barton and North and South, are the novels, if you like, that depict the condition of the working classes in England, and specifically within Manchester as well.
It seems like quite a strange subject to be writing about. I mean, she's obviously, very comfortably well-off middle-class woman. I would almost have expected her to be writing romantic novels rather than something as gritty as that.
Yeah, I can see where that's coming from. Her novels do have a romantic plot, so her female heroines do end up getting married. But within that, she's also really, really interested in using her fiction and using her novels to bring the plight of the working classes to her middle-class readership. So she sees her fiction as a means of opening windows into what the life of a mill factory worker would look like.
Was there quite a kind of moral impetus behind what she was doing, or was she effectively just exploiting that kind of gritty lifestyle?
I think there's a very, very keen social consciousness at work in her novel. So she's really interested in the idea that her fiction can bring the plight of the working classes to her middle-class readership for the express purposes of changing the way in which they think about their factories, the way in which they think about the conditions of their employees. So it really brings her readership to a new awareness of what capitalism is doing, what industrialisation is doing.
The interior of Gaskell's house records the domestic side of 19th century middle-class life, but I'm on the hunt for evidence of the powerful impression Gaskell's first novel had on Britain's most popular ever author.
Oh, this is incredibly special. I'm sitting in Elizabeth Gaskell's house looking at the original letter that Charles Dickens sent her. Isn't that wonderful? 31st of January, 1850. Just imagine her, perhaps sitting right here, opening this letter. Dear Mrs. Gaskell, he says, you might have seen that I'm starting a new weekly journal. And he says to her that he doesn't know what she's up to, but I do honestly know that there is no living English writer whose aid I would desire to enlist in preference to the authoress of Mary Barton, a book that most profoundly affected and impressed me. I mean, with somebody the stature of Dickens writing to you, it's like having just published something and J.K. Rowling writes to you to say how much she appreciates your work. And it's just, oh, it's amazing. She must have been so excited to open this letter right here.
The plight of Britain's industrial workers may have been so severe that it compelled authors like Elizabeth Gaskell to write about it. Across the Atlantic, enslaved people on the plantations faced an even greater struggle. And once again, the people of Manchester would take up the fight.
I've been exploring Manchester, the best place to see how the harshness of life during Britain's early industrial era sparked a revolutionary spirit that would change Britain and the world.
At the heart of Manchester in the industrial age were the cotton mills, employing thousands of workers and dominating the local economy. But the mills were completely dependent on a supply of raw cotton coming in from the deep south of America.
Of course, that cotton was picked by vast armies of enslaved African Americans. In 1861, civil war broke out in America, with slavery the major flashpoint. Abraham Lincoln's government supported abolition, whilst the southern states, dependent on slave labour, found such a policy abhorrent.
It may have all been happening thousands of miles away from Manchester, but the ripples of war would be keenly felt here.
To learn more, I'm meeting Dr. Natalie Zarchek from the University of Manchester.
Natalie, what was happening in the American Civil War that had such an impact on Manchester?
Basically, an economic meltdown. During the Civil War, the Union Navy blockaded all the major southern ports, so the cotton wasn't getting out of the South, and it wasn't coming to the Manchester area. So therefore, there was no work for the cotton workers, and they were mostly thrown out of work and had only really private and religious charity to rely on to support themselves and their families.
And what was the reaction to that amongst the workers in terms of what they thought was going on in America?
They felt quite strongly that the struggle against slavery was a noble one, and that even though it was directly harming them and their families, that it was something that they thought was right, and they greatly supported it.
And how did they express their support for the Union?
They held a big meeting of working people at the Free Trade Hall on New Year's Eve of 1862, where they put together a letter which they sent to Abraham Lincoln, in which they expressed their hatred of slavery and their support of his and the Union Army's attempts to eradicate it.
And how did Lincoln respond to them?
Yeah, he did, and not only did he respond, but very quickly, considering that he was probably rather busy at the time.
Yeah.
Lincoln writes them a letter from the White House saying how moved he was to receive their letter, and that he was truly stunned that people who were losing everything, taking the bread out of their children's mouths, that nonetheless they supported what he had to say.
Do you think at this point, is it possible to say where Manchester was with, I suppose, the anti-slavery movement as regards the rest of the UK?
Manchester was really the heart of the anti-slavery movement. Many famous white and black abolitionists, including people such as Frederick Douglass, came through Manchester to raise funds and awareness.
Frederick Douglass himself was a freed slave.
Well, actually, when he came to Britain, he was only a runaway slave. And eventually, a number of wealthy abolitionists contributed funds to buy him out of slavery so that he would not risk being arrested and returned back to his master's plantation. He was really quite fascinated by Manchester, not just that it was such a strong city for abolitionists, but that it was full of radical political and social movements.
From the fight against slavery to campaigning for affordable food, from marching and dying for a voice in Parliament to the call for class war, 19th century Manchester is like a greatest hits of radical movements and iconic changemakers. And we haven't even yet mentioned the town's most famous daughter.
Time magazine included her in their list of the 20th century's most influential people. She was someone that went toe-to-toe with the establishment, who suffered enormous personal hardship, fighting for a fairer society, for equality. She was the firebrand women's rights activist, Emmeline Pankhurst.
Born in Manchester in 1858, Emmeline grew up in a family steeped in radical politics. But it was in the first decade of the 1900s that she really made her mark. I've come to the People's History Museum to get a sneak preview of a remarkable antique textile that was paraded at the Great Suffragette March in London's Hyde Park in 1908.
Oh my goodness, it's huge and beautiful. That's so impressive. The colours are so vivid. Look at that, Manchester, first in the fight. This is where the suffragette movement started. Founded by Mrs. Pankhurst in 1903. That's when she founds the Women's Social and Political Union. This is the fight for votes for women, for equality. It's an important moment in Manchester's history. It's a massively important moment in British history.
This delicate banner is a rare survivor from the era and was only recently brought to the museum by curator Jenny Mabbott.
Hello.
Hello.
Jenny, I'm so excited about this banner. How did you come to acquire it at the museum?
Well, we saw an auction listing for the banner, and we went and saw the banner and realised it was authentic.
Where had it been all these years, though?
It had been with a small charity in a filing cabinet, would you believe, and then they decided to put it up for auction. We bid and were outbid by a dealer, but then we made contact with the dealer, had a crowdfunding campaign, got lots of public support, and then we were able to acquire the banner and bring it home to Manchester.
That's just perfect as well that it was crowdfunding that brought it back here.
Yeah.
Emmeline Pankhurst's campaign achieved its aim just a few weeks after her death, when all adult women were finally given the vote in 1928. But her cause is still very much alive and kicking. I'm meeting Caroline Pankhurst. She's no relation, but chose to change her name in honour of her heroine.
Caroline, tell me about the legacy of Emmeline Pankhurst and how she's influenced you.
I first came to hear about Emmeline Pankhurst at a play at the National Theatre, and it had a massive impact for realising what struggle women had gone through to get women the vote.
Yeah.
And then it was a real eye-opener for me personally to have an opportunity to then look at where are we still today.
Do you think Emmeline Pankhurst would be pleasantly surprised or slightly disappointed by where we'd got to now with equality?
I don't think that she would be surprised, and I think she would be quite horrified at how social media has added another way of silencing and oppressing women. So I think there are a lot of things that have changed in society now that she would probably recognise need addressing. The things that she fought for, whilst she was very single-minded at the time in terms of wanting to get women the vote so that we were able to participate in decision-making, what that ultimately was about striving towards, we're still nowhere near. So her legacy has to live on, which is why it's so important that Manchester has this statue here now.
And is it unusual in Manchester to have a statue of a woman?
So would you believe it if I told you she's the first, apart from a royal statue? And that's not good enough, is it? She exists here and she inspires the future generations, and we need to see more role models. We need to see more of these amazing women in history peppered around our cities in the same way that we've got these remarkable men from history peppered around them.
So many of these radical movements seem to have started right here in Manchester. What is it about Manchester?
I don't know. I think it's the northern grit. I think it's that we keep going and we see injustice and we're prepared to do something about it because we won't tolerate it and we want change. We are a city of change makers, and I, for one, am very proud of that.
It's great to see that tradition of protest thriving in this century. But Emmeline Pankhurst's achievements would be a rare high point for Manchester throughout much of the 20th century.
The textile industry was decimated. The engineering jobs that were created to replace it had also dried up. The turbulent, buoyant years of the 19th century were consigned to history, but they left an indelible imprint underneath it all.
Typified by the spirit of renewal transforming the city today, 19th century Manchester and its people had refused to suffer in silence. Instead, this town collectively rose up, becoming a powerhouse of progression, reshaping Britain and the world far beyond.
I can't think of a more fitting way to end my time in Manchester than to pay tribute to Emmeline Pankhurst and to all the Manchester radicals, those brave men and women who called out inequality and injustice wherever they saw it, who fought for the greater good, for what was right. And their work goes on.